Nicaea, May 337. A man is dying. He has ruled the Roman Empire for 31 years. He has won battles that changed the shape of the known world. He has built a city and named it after himself. He has taken a religion that was, within his own lifetime, punishable by death, and made it the favored faith of the most powerful empire on earth. He is surrounded by bishops, men who have spent their lives serving the God he spent his life elevating, and he is asking to be baptized for the very first time. He removes his imperial robes. He puts on white, the color of the newly initiated, the color of someone just beginning. He has been emperor for 31 years, and he is dressing like a beginner. He dies 3 days later, still wearing white. Now, hold that image. This is the man who built the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, who presided over the Council of Nicaea, where the central doctrine of Christian faith was decided for the next 2,000 years, who wrote letters defending the Church, funded the Church, and spent 3 decades making the Church the most powerful institution in the Western world. He did all of that without ever once being baptized. So, the question this story is really asking is not about religion. It is not about Rome. It is about a man, about the distance between what a person builds for the world and what that person actually keeps for himself. Who was Constantine? That question does not have a clean answer, but the life does, and the life is where we begin. In the last decades of the 3rd century, the Roman Empire was not collapsing. It was something worse than collapsing. It was surviving, lurching forward, held together by the sheer weight of what it had been, even as everything that had made it work was quietly coming apart at the edges. In the 50 years before Constantine was born, Rome had more than 20 emperors. Most of them died violently, assassinated by their own guards, killed by rivals, executed by successors who needed them gone before they could become a problem. The throne was not something you inherited and kept. It was something you seized and defended every single day, until the day you could no longer defend it. This is the world Constantine was born into, around 272, in a military town called Naissus, in what is now Serbia. His father was Constantius, a Roman officer moving steadily upward through the ranks, a capably man, a careful man, the kind of man who understood, with the clarity that comes from watching others fail. That talent alone did not determine who survived in Rome. Decisions made at exactly the right moment did. His mother was Helena. The sources disagree about who she was before Constantius. Some call her the daughter of an innkeeper. Some are more generous. What the sources agree on is simpler and more important than her origins. She was not the kind of woman a Roman officer kept beside him when his career demanded something more useful. She was the kind of woman he left behind. Constantine was around 12 years old when his father abandoned Helena and married Theodora, the stepdaughter of the emperor Maximian. It was not a romantic decision. It was a structural one. Constantius needed the political connection. The connection required the marriage. Helena was in the way of both. She was removed, quietly. Finally, we do not know what Constantine was told about this. We do not know if anyone sat down and explained it to him, or if he simply watched it happen the way children watch things happen. When the adults around them have decided that explanation is unnecessary, what we know is what the boy who watched it became. And what he became began here. In the specific silence that followed a specific departure, Helena did not disappear from his life. She remained, somewhere at the edge of it, in the way that people remain when they have been displaced from the center, without being fully removed. Constantine did not forget her. There is no evidence he ever tried to, and in the decades that followed, when he had the power to do something about what had been done to her, he did. He elevated her, gave her the title of Augusta, built cities in her name, let her spend imperial money on pilgrimages and charity, with a generosity that the sources describe as genuine and unchecked. But that came later, much later. In the years that followed the departure, what Constantine had was the lesson the departure taught, delivered not in words but in the grammar of watching someone you love be moved out of the picture because someone more powerful had decided she no longer fit. Position is conditional. Warmth does not protect you. The people who smile at you across the table are also, simultaneously, calculating what you are worth to them. He did not articulate this. He was 12. But the body learns what the mind cannot yet name. And what his body learned in the months after Helena was left behind was a kind of permanent alertness to the question of where power actually resided in any given room. Not long after, Constantine was sent east, to the imperial court of Diocletian in Nicaea, the largest city in the Eastern Empire, and the administrative heart of everything Diocletian had built. Officially, he was there to be educated, to absorb the workings of imperial power from close range, to become the kind of man his father needed him to become. He was also a hostage, not in the crude sense of the word. The Romans had refined the practice into something almost elegant. You were housed in comfortable quarters. You were treated with visible respect. You were given access to the finest teachers the empire could provide, the best libraries, the most consequential conversations. You ate well. You wore good clothes. Nobody ever used the word hostage in your presence, but everyone in that court understood exactly what you were. You were the guarantee, the living proof that your father, commanding troops somewhere on the distant frontier, would not make any move that required the people holding you to make an example of you. Your comfort was conditional. Your safety was a function of someone else's good behavior, and the people responsible for both your comfort and your safety wanted you to understand that, without ever needing to say it out loud. The sophistication of the arrangement was itself part of the lesson. Crude imprisonment announces itself. This did not announce itself. It simply existed, in the texture of every interaction, in the particular quality of the courtesy extended to him, in the way certain conversations stopped when he entered a room and resumed after he left. A boy paying attention, and Constantine was always paying attention, learned from that texture something more durable than anything the official curriculum offered. He learned that the most dangerous constraints are the ones that do not look like constraints. That control, at its most refined, does not announce itself as control. It simply arranges the conditions so that certain choices become unthinkable and others feel like the only natural option. Diocletian, the emperor whose court Constantine inhabited, was one of the most administratively gifted rulers Rome ever produced. He had taken an empire that was destroying its own leaders faster than it could replace them, and imposed on it a system designed to prevent any single person from accumulating enough power to destabilize everything when they fell. He called it the tetrarchy. 4 rulers, 2 senior, 2 junior, each governing a different region, each theoretically equal, each theoretically cooperating, each bound to the others by a structure larger than any of them individually. It was the most sophisticated attempt in Roman history to make power institutional rather than personal, to build a system more important than the man at its center. Constantine watched this from the inside. He watched how the meetings worked and how the decisions were actually made. He watched the difference between the official description of shared power and the reality of where authority actually resided when something important needed to happen. He watched Diocletian sit at the center of his own supposedly equal arrangement, never fully surrendering the thread that connected every part of the system back to him personally, maintaining the appearance of the structure while quietly ensuring that the structure served his particular position within it. He was learning something that no one was teaching him intentionally. He was learning that the architecture of power and the reality of power are almost never the same thing, that the map and the territory diverge at exactly the moments that matter most, that the man who understands that divergence and can navigate it has an advantage over every man who takes the official description at face value. There is one more thing happening in these years that matters enormously for everything that follows. Diocletian's reign ended with what history calls the Great Persecution. Beginning in 303, the empire launched the most systematic, most sustained attempt to destroy Christianity that the religion had ever faced. Churches were burned. Scriptures were confiscated and destroyed. Christians across the empire were given a choice between publicly renouncing their faith or facing the consequences of refusing. The consequences were severe. Constantine was in Nicaea when it began. He watched what a state looks like when it decides that a religion is an existential threat and commits the full weight of its administrative and military power to eliminating it. He watched Christians lose property, lose freedom, lose their lives. He also watched something else. He watched the communities hold. Not everywhere. Not everyone. There were people who recanted, people who handed over their scriptures, people who decided that survival was worth the cost of compliance. But the structure did not break. The networks of bishops and deacons and local communities that connected Christians across provincial boundaries continued to function even under sustained attack. The faith did not dissolve under pressure the way Diocletian had apparently expected it to. Constantine filed that away, not because he was secretly Christian, there is no credible evidence of that, but because Constantine was the kind of person who noticed things that other people missed and remembered things that other people forgot. And what he had just watched was a community that the full organized force of Roman state power had tried to destroy and could not. That was not a theological observation. That was information about what durable power actually looked like from the inside, about what it was built from, about what made it survive when everything applied against it should have been enough to finish it. He did not know yet exactly what he would do with that information, but he would not forget it. And the moment for using it was closer than anyone in that court, including Constantine himself, fully understood. Galerius became the dominant figure in the Eastern Empire after Diocletian abdicated in 305. Galerius was the architect of the Great Persecution. He was the man who had pushed hardest for the systematic destruction of Christianity, who had convinced Diocletian that the religion was incompatible with Roman order and needed to be eliminated before it became something the empire could no longer control. He was also, by the logic of the Tetrarchy, the man now most responsible for deciding what happened to the people around him. Constantine understood his position with the clarity of someone who had spent years learning to read exactly this kind of room. He had watched Galerius operate for years. He knew how the man thought, what he feared, and what he did to the things he feared. Staying in Nicaea, inside the orbit of a man who had no particular reason to want him alive and several structural reasons to prefer him gone, was not a strategy. It was a postponement of an outcome. He left. The exact details depend on which source you read, and what that source needed the story to mean. What the sources agree on is the shape of it. Constantine departed in the night, moving fast, taking the post horses from each station along the road and either killing them or taking them with him, so that no organized pursuit could follow at any useful speed. By the time anyone understood what had happened, he was already too far gone to catch. This was not panic. This was a planned exit, executed at the moment when execution became necessary and not one day later. Constantine had been reading that room for years. When the reading told him the moment had arrived, he moved without hesitation and without sentiment. He reached his father in Britain. Constantius had been campaigning in the north, pushing against the Picts along the edge of the empire's most remote frontier, doing the grinding, unglamorous work that kept the borders functional. He was already sick when Constantine arrived. He died at York in 306, with his son beside him. The troops standing in that field made a decision that was technically illegal and practically inevitable. They looked at the son of the man they had followed, and they shouted his name. Constantine was declared emperor by acclamation, in a field in northern Britain, by soldiers who had no constitutional authority to do what they were doing, and who did it anyway, because the alternative was uncertainty. And uncertainty, in the Roman military of this period, had a way of becoming violence very quickly. The tetrarchy had a process for succession. That process did not involve soldiers shouting in fields. But the tetrarchy, as Constantine had spent years observing from the inside, was a description of how power was supposed to work, rather than a reliable account of how it actually worked. If you could hold what you claimed, the claiming became legitimate over time. If you could not hold it, no amount of procedural correctness would save you. Constantine could hold it. What followed was 6 years of the most careful, most patient, most methodically executed political and military maneuvering of his era. The Roman world in this period had multiple men who considered themselves emperor simultaneously, each controlling different territory, each watching the others for the first sign of exploitable weakness. Constantine controlled Gaul and Britain and Spain. He was not the strongest claimant. He was not the best positioned. He had come to his claim through a field acclamation that his rivals could, with some justification, dismiss as irregular. He was also the most patient man in the room. He made alliances when alliances were useful. He allowed those alliances to expire when they stopped serving his position. He won battles and absorbed territories and built, over those 6 years, the kind of military force that reflects a commander who does not intend to need a second opportunity to get something right. His army was not the largest. It was the most coherent. There is a difference. And Constantine understood the difference. The way a man understands something he has spent his entire life studying, without being able to name what he was studying. There is something in these years that the purely military account of Constantine's rise tends to move past too quickly. Something that belongs here because it shapes what comes next. Helena, she was living somewhere in the Western Empire during these years, in the particular kind of invisibility that falls on people who have been displaced from the center of power, without being fully destroyed by the displacement. She was the mother of an emperor now. That changed her circumstances in material ways. Constantine saw to that. But the relationship between them in these years, the actual texture of it, what passed between a son who had watched his mother be set aside and a mother who had watched her son become the most powerful man in the Western world. The sources do not fully preserve that. What the sources preserve are the outcomes, the title he gave her, the cities he named for her, the freedom she was given. Later, to travel and spend and build in ways that reflected genuine trust rather than mere ceremonial honor. And one detail that sits quietly in the record and does not announce its own significance. When Helena eventually made her famous pilgrimage to Jerusalem, traveling in her 70s to the places where her faith told her the most important events in human history had occurred, she went with imperial resources and imperial blessing. Her sons sent her, or permitted her to go in a way that amounted to sending her. Whatever the years of distance had done to the relationship, they had not broken the thing underneath it. That matters for Constantine not as a sentimental footnote but as a genuine data point about who he was. He had learned, very early, that people could be used. He had watched his father use his mother and set her aside. He had himself lived as someone else's instrument for years in Nicaea. He understood the logic of using people with a precision that came from having been used. And yet, Helena, the one person most visibly moved off the board by the calculus of his father's ambition, was also the one person in his life whom the available evidence suggests he loved without calculation. That is not a contradiction. It is a complexity, and it is one of the few places in Constantine's story where something comes through that does not fit the machinery. By 312, the Western Empire had simplified itself down to two men: Constantine, controlling everything north and west of the Alps, and Maxentius, who held Rome itself, and Italy, and Africa, and who had, by any reasonable strategic assessment, the stronger hand. He had the symbolic weight of Rome behind him. He had more troops. He had the psychological and logistical advantages of a man defending his own territory against someone who had chosen to cross the Alps in the spring with an army his own advisors had told him was too small for what he was attempting. Maxentius also had something that Constantine had learned, from years of watching powerful men fail, was more dangerous than any external weakness. He had stopped being afraid. 6 years of surviving challenges that should have finished him had produced in Maxentius the particular confidence of a man who has been tested and has not broken. That confidence had shaded, gradually and invisibly, into the kind of certainty that stops reading the situation accurately because it has decided in advance what the situation means. He had looked at his numerical advantage and concluded that the open field was where that advantage would matter most. So when Constantine's forces approached Rome, moving faster than anyone had anticipated, winning engagements at Turin and Verona with a speed that compressed the strategic timeline Maxentius had prepared for, Maxentius made the decision that military historians have been arguing about ever since. Rather than staying inside Rome, behind walls that Constantine's army would have struggled to breach, he came out to fight in the open, on the north bank of the Tiber, with the river immediately behind his own lines. He gave up his greatest advantage because his certainty had convinced him he did not need it. Constantine had crossed the Alps in the spring with an army his advisors called too small. He had moved faster than the situation was supposed to allow. He was 6 days away from the most important battle of his life, against a numerically superior force, with Rome and everything Rome meant waiting on the other side of the outcome. He needed to win. That was the military reality, but he also needed something that a military victory alone could not provide. He needed a story, not just for the people watching from the outside, but for the men fighting beside him, who needed to believe they were part of something larger than a particularly ambitious commander's drive for total power. Every tradition available to him offered that story in some form. Rome had gods who endorsed campaigns, blessed armies, appeared in dreams to commanders on the eve of significant battles. This was the normal language of Roman military culture. Constantine had grown up inside it, He knew how to use it. But in those days, before the bridge, something else was forming in his mind. Something that reached past the normal language, past the gods who had presided over 50 years of civil war and 20 emperors dying badly, toward the community he had watched survive the full force of Roman state power, toward the network that stretched across the empire in ways that no other organization could match, toward whatever it was that had made those people hold when everything applied against them should have been enough to break them. What exactly happened in the nights before the battle? What he saw, or dreamed, or decided, or slowly constructed into something he could act on, is a question the next chapter will sit inside, because the answer matters less than what he chose to do with it, and what he chose to do with it changed everything. What happened in the days before the Battle of Milvian Bridge is one of the most argued questions in all of Roman history. Constantine said he saw something, a sign in the sky, light forming into a shape above the sun, visible to his entire army, accompanied by words. In Greek, by this, onker. That night, he said, Christ appeared to him in a dream and instructed him to put the sign on his soldiers' shields. He told this story to his biographer, Eusebius of Caesarea, decades after the battle, with his empire secured and his legacy already being written. He swore by his own life that it was true. He had nothing obvious to gain from the claim by that point except the claim itself. There is an earlier account, written closer to the event, that describes only the dream. No vision in the sky, no army of witnesses, just Constantine, alone in the night, receiving an instruction. The two accounts do not fully agree with each other. Historians have been arguing about this for 1700 years. Was it a real meteorological phenomenon? An atmospheric optical effect that a man primed for significance interpreted as divine communication? Was it a deliberate construction? A story shaped after the fact to explain a decision already made for other reasons? Was it something that cannot be cleanly categorized? A moment of conviction experienced in the only vocabulary available to a man of his era and his formation? The honest answer is that nobody knows. Nobody can know. And spending too long inside that argument is a way of missing what the story is actually about. Because here is what is not disputed. Constantine ordered the Chi marked on his soldiers' shields, the first two letters of the word Christ in Greek, overlaid into a single symbol. An army that had marched under Roman eagles and traditional standards went into the most important battle of its commander's life carrying a Christian symbol. That happened. Whatever preceded it, that happened. The battle itself was not particularly close. Maxentius had positioned his forces with the Tiber River immediately behind them, removing any possibility of organized retreat if the line broke. When Constantine's cavalry hit the flank and the Roman formation began to collapse inward, the retreat became a rout, and the rout became a catastrophe. Maxentius drowned in the river, pulled under by the weight of his own armor, in the water, behind the position he had chosen. Constantine entered Rome on the 29th of October, 312. Now watch exactly what he does next, because this is the moment the entire story pivots on. And it is not the battle itself. Every Roman emperor before him who conquered or entered Rome in triumph went to the temples, to Jupiter, Optimus Maximus, on the Capitoline Hill, the father of the gods, the divine patron of Roman power since the city's founding. You made your offerings. You performed the rituals that every Roman general and emperor before you had performed for centuries. You gave the gods their public credit so that everyone watching understood that your victory carried divine sanction in the proper Roman, recognizable way. Constantine did not go to the temples. He did not perform the sacrifices. He did not acknowledge Jupiter. In a city that had been built around these rituals, that understood power and divine favor as things expressed through these specific public acts, the man who had just conquered it declined to perform them. Everyone in Rome noticed. The sources make clear that they noticed. This was not a private theological position quietly maintained. This was a public act, performed at the moment of maximum visibility, in front of a city that was reading every gesture he made for information about what kind of ruler he intended to be. He was not simply declining a ritual. He was making a statement in the language that Roman public life understood best, the language of what the most powerful person in the room chose to do with his body when everyone was watching. He was telling Rome that the world had changed without saying a word. Now hold the military victory and this public refusal together and ask what they add up to. A man crosses the Alps with an army his own advisers considered undersized. He wins engagements that consolidate his approach to Rome. He defeats a numerically superior force in a pitched battle. He enters the most important city in the Western world. And at the moment when every previous ruler in Roman history would have performed the ritual acknowledgement of the gods who blessed Roman power, he does something different. Something that points toward a community he had spent years watching survive what Rome threw at it. What followed in the weeks and months after Rome was not a sudden transformation. Constantine was too careful for sudden transformations. But a pattern began to emerge that would define the next 30 years of his reign. And understanding that pattern requires understanding something about what he had just won and what he still needed. He had won Rome. He had not yet won legitimacy. Not the deep kind. Not the kind that makes people follow you. Not because they fear the consequences of refusing, but because they have accepted, at some level that goes beneath fear, that your authority means something real. Every emperor before him had tried to solve that problem with the old tools, with the gods of Rome, with military success, with the accumulated symbolic weight of the purple and the eagles and the 1,000 years of history that Rome carried like a living monument to itself. Those tools had worked, more or less. When the empire was cohering, they had been failing, more or less. For 50 years of civil war and assassination and the particular kind of institutional exhaustion that comes from watching the thing you were told to believe in keep not delivering on its promises. Constantine had watched something else deliver on its promises under conditions that should have destroyed it. In the months after Milvian Bridge, he met with Licinius, the emperor controlling the eastern half of the empire, in Milan in 313. Together they issued what history calls the Edict of Milan. It was not technically an edict. It was a letter sent to provincial governors outlining a new policy, but its substance was genuinely new. For the first time in Roman history, an imperial document stated that religious belief was a matter between an individual and whatever divine power that individual recognized, and that the state had no legitimate claim to interfere with it. Property confiscated from Christians during the Great Persecution was to be returned. The legal standing of the Church as an institution was recognized. The Great Persecution was officially over. But Constantine was not simply ending a persecution. He was opening a door. And what he was inviting through that door was not just a community that had suffered unjustly. It was a network, an organizational structure, a way of connecting people across vast distances around shared commitments that Roman paganism, for all its centuries of tradition, had never managed to build. He had found, at Milvian Bridge and in the months that followed, something more than a new religion to favor. He had found a new language, a language capable of saying things about power and legitimacy and the basis of authority that the old language could no longer say convincingly. Whether he believed in that language, the way the people who had built it believed in it, is a question that will run through the rest of this story without receiving a clean answer. What is clear is that he understood what it was worth, and that understanding, more than the battle, more than the vision, more than anything else that happened in 312, is what makes Milvian Bridge the hinge on which the history of the Western world turns. He had crossed a river. He had also crossed something else, something with no name in the vocabulary available to him then, something that the 1700 years since have been trying, with incomplete success, to name. The man who entered Rome in 312 was not the man who had crossed the Alps in the spring, not because he had seen a vision, but because he had made a choice, and choices made at sufficient scale, with sufficient conviction, by people with sufficient power to act on them, do not stay choices for long. They become the world. Helena came to court sometime in the years after Milvian Bridge, not as a supplicant, not as a woman restored to a position she had been removed from by forces beyond her control. Grateful for the reversal of her fortune, she came as Augusta, Empress Mother, a title Constantine gave her that carried real authority and real resources, and that announced to everyone watching that the woman his father had set aside when ambition required, it was now, by the decision of the most powerful man in the Western world. Untouchable, he did not have to do this. No political logic required it. The move carried no strategic advantage that a different gesture could not have achieved more efficiently. He did it because she was his mother, and because what had been done to her had been wrong, and because Constantine, for all the complexity of what he was and what he was becoming, had not forgotten the 12-year-old boy who watched her leave. She came to court, and the court reorganized itself around her presence, the way courts reorganize themselves around whatever the person at the center decides to make important. That detail matters here. At the beginning of this chapter, because what follows is the story of a man building the most consequential religious and political architecture of his era, and it is easy, standing at the scale of that building, to see only the structure and lose the person inside it, to see the strategy and miss the hand behind the strategy, to see the emperor and forget the boy who had watched his mother walk out of the picture because someone more powerful had decided she no longer fit. The hand was always there. The boy was always there, operating underneath the emperor, shaping decisions that the purely strategic account of Constantine's reign can explain but cannot fully account for. Helena is the evidence of that. The cities named for her, the pilgrimage funded with imperial resources, the grief at her death that the sources describe in terms they do not use for most of what Constantine lost. She was the one place in his life where the formation that had made him capable of everything else did not fully apply, where something operated that did not reduce to calculation. He had built the world she was now moving through, the churches she visited, the communities she served with the charity her son's resources made possible, the faith she inhabited with the wholeness that he himself could not quite manage. She lived in the house he had built, and in doing so, she showed him, without intending to show him anything, what the house looked like from the inside, what it was for, what it could hold that the outside could not. He watched her inhabit it and continued building it from the threshold. That was the architecture of their relationship in those years, and it was also, in a way that neither of them could have fully articulated, the architecture of his relationship to everything he was doing, building something real, for reasons that included calculation, and also exceeded it, from a position that was always adjacent to the thing itself. Which brings us to the empire, and to the question that was shaping every decision Constantine was making in the years after Milvian Bridge, whether or not he was framing it in those terms. Power has always needed a story, not just soldiers, not just laws, not just the administrative machinery that moves grain from one province to another and keeps the roads functional and collects the taxes that pay for everything else. All of that is necessary. None of it is sufficient, because the people inside an empire do not simply obey because the mechanisms of obedience are in place. They obey because they have, at some level, accepted a story about why the person at the top deserves to be at the top. That story can take many forms: divine right, military supremacy, ancestral legitimacy, the favor of the gods. Every durable political order in human history has had one, and the orders that collapsed fastest were almost always the ones whose story stopped being believable before anything else had failed. By 313, the Roman story was in serious trouble, not because Rome lacked power. It had enormous power. Its armies were still the most effective fighting force in the Western world. Its administrative system, for all its dysfunction, still moved information and resources across distances that no other organization on Earth could match. Its cities were still the largest and most sophisticated on the continent, but the story that held all of that together had been fracturing for decades. The gods who had blessed Roman expansion were the same gods who had presided over 50 years of civil war and 20 emperors dying violently. The divine mandate of any individual emperor had become increasingly difficult to assert with a straight face when the average reign lasted less than 3 years, and most of them ended in assassination. The temples were still standing. The rituals were still being performed, but the story they were telling had developed the quality that stories develop when too many things have happened that the story cannot explain. It had stopped being convincing. Constantine was not the first person to notice this, but he was the first person in a position to do something about it, who had also spent years watching an alternative take shape in the communities that had survived the Great Persecution. The Christian community that had survived was, by 313, the most coherent, non-governmental organization in the Roman world. It had a clear hierarchy: bishops in major cities, priests in smaller communities, deacons handling the practical work of caring for the poor and sick and imprisoned, all of them connected to each other through a network of correspondence and counsel, and shared authority that crossed every provincial boundary the empire had drawn. It had a shared text, a shared set of practices, a shared calendar, a shared understanding of what membership meant and what it required. When a Christian traveled from Rome to Antioch to Alexandria, the community they found at the other end was recognizably the same community they had left. The bishop spoke with authority that other bishops acknowledged. The rituals were the same. The story was the same. This was something Roman paganism had never achieved and could not achieve, because Roman paganism was not organized around coherence. It was organized around local traditions, local gods, local rituals that made sense in their specific place and did not need to make sense anywhere else. A religious landscape of enormous variety, held together by nothing stronger than the shared performance of imperial cult. And even that had been losing its grip for decades. Constantine saw this with the particular clarity of someone who had been studying what power needed to sustain itself since before he was old enough to name what he was studying. He was not approaching Christianity as a theologian. He was approaching it as a man who had spent his life watching institutions succeed and fail, and who recognized in the structure of the church something that the structure of the empire desperately needed and could not generate from within itself. It was not the theology that caught his attention first. It was the architecture. What followed in the years after Milvian Bridge was a relationship between Constantine and the Christian bishops that was genuinely mutual in a way that is easy to miss if you are looking for simple exploitation in one direction or simple faith in the other. The bishops needed what Constantine could provide: safety first, the end of persecution, the return of property confiscated during the Great Persecution, legal recognition of the Church as an institution with standing in Roman law. These were not abstract benefits. These were the difference between a community that could function openly and one that had to operate in the margins of an empire that could decide at any moment to destroy it again. Beyond safety, resources, Constantine began funding the construction of churches on a scale that transformed the physical landscape of the empire. The Lateran Basilica in Rome, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem, the Church of the Nativity in Bethlehem. These were not modest buildings. They were among the largest and most architecturally ambitious structures of their era, announcing to everyone who saw them that the community inside was no longer marginal. Constantine needed what the bishops could provide in return. He needed their network, their reach into communities across the empire that his administrative apparatus could not penetrate with anything like the same depth or reliability. He needed their moral authority, the particular kind of legitimacy that comes from being trusted, not because you are powerful, but because you are believed to speak for something larger than power. And he needed the organizational capacity they had built, the ability to coordinate action across vast distances through structures that had proven they could survive sustained attack. He got all of it. But watch the coins, because while all of this is happening, while Constantine is writing letters to bishops and funding basilicas and exempting the clergy from civic obligations that consumed the time and resources of every other class in Roman society, the coins of the empire still carry Sol Invictus, the unconquered sun, the deity that his soldiers still recognized, that the population of the empire was still, in its majority, oriented toward. He held both simultaneously, the Christian God and the sun God, present on the same coins, operating in the same empire, neither one officially displacing the other. He also retained the title of Pontifex Maximus, chief priest of the traditional Roman religion, the person officially responsible for maintaining the correct relationship between Rome and its gods. Every emperor had held this title. Constantine kept it. He did not resign it when he began favoring Christianity. He did not resign it when he presided over Nicaea. He held it until he died, remaining officially responsible for the religious machinery of the old world while building the institutional foundation of the new one. This was not hypocrisy in the simple sense. It was navigation. The navigation of a man who understood that the most durable changes are the ones that do not look like changes until they are already complete. That you do not transform an empire by announcing the transformation. You transform it by making the new thing more available, more rewarded, more structurally advantageous than the old thing, and then waiting for the people inside the system to respond to the new conditions the way people have always responded to conditions. He changed the incentives. And when you change the incentives inside a system as large and as inertial as the Roman Empire, you do not need to issue commands. The system begins to move on its own, in the direction the new conditions point, at the pace that large systems move, which is slower than any individual wants and faster than any individual fully controls. The empire did not convert because Constantine commanded it to convert. It began to convert because conversion became, over the decades of his reign, the rational response to the world he was building. Helena understood this world perhaps better than anyone else around him. She had lived at its margins long enough to know what it looked like from outside the center. And when she moved through it as Augusta, when she used the resources her son provided to build churches and care for the poor and make her pilgrimage to Jerusalem, she was not performing the piety that her position required. She was inhabiting the faith that Constantine was building the infrastructure for, with the wholeness that he himself could not quite manage. That gap between them, between the mother, who could enter the thing fully, and the son, who kept building it from the outside, is not something the historical record dwells on, but it is there, in the texture of what each of them did with the same faith in the same years, in the difference between the woman who traveled to Jerusalem because her faith demanded it, and the man who planned the same journey and never made it, in the difference between the person who lived inside the house and the person who kept adding rooms to it from the doorstep. He built the house. She lived in it. And whatever passed between them in the private spaces that the sources do not preserve, that difference was present, real, quiet, a small, human version of the larger question that his entire reign was organized around, but never quite answered. There is a specific kind of loneliness that comes from building something you cannot fully enter. An architect who designs a cathedral but does not believe in the God it was built for. A lawmaker who writes protections for a community he does not belong to. A father who constructs a life for his children that he himself was never allowed to have. The building is real. The effort is genuine. The result stands and functions and serves the people inside it. But the builder stands at the threshold, always arriving, never quite there. Constantine built the most consequential religious infrastructure in Western history. He funded it, protected it, legislated for it, fought for it in councils and in courts, and in the complex political negotiations that shaped the early church into the institution it became. He did all of that across 3 decades of sustained, deliberate effort. He was never baptized. Not once. Not in 31 years of building the Christian world. That fact sits at the center of everything this story is trying to understand. Not as evidence of hypocrisy, which is too simple. Not as evidence of sincere but cautious faith, which is too generous. As a fact that requires sitting inside for longer than is comfortable, because what it points toward is something more complicated and more human than either of those readings allows. Begin with what baptism meant in the 4th century, because it is not what it means today. In the theology of Constantine's era, baptism was not primarily a public declaration of belief. It was a sacrament of transformation. It washed away sin, completely and permanently, in a way that the ongoing practice of Christian life could not replicate. The person who emerged from the baptismal waters was, in a genuine theological sense, a new person, clean, unburdened, starting over. The problem, for anyone who held power in the Roman world, was what came after. Sin did not stop accumulating after baptism. It continued with every decision, every compromise, every act of violence or deception or self-interest that the exercise of power in the ancient world routinely required. And the theological mechanisms for dealing with post-baptismal sin in the 4th century were considerably more demanding than what came before it. Public penance, exclusion from communion, the kind of visible, humiliating accountability that a Roman emperor could not easily submit to without undermining the authority that his entire capacity to govern depended on. Some historians argue that Constantine's delayed baptism was pure calculation, that he understood exactly what he was doing and why, that he was preserving his theological flexibility, keeping his sins in a kind of running account that he intended to clear in a single transaction at the end, when the political costs of full Christian accountability no longer applied because he was about to die anyway. That argument has the uncomfortable quality of being entirely plausible, but it does not account for everything. Consider Constantinople. In 330, Constantine dedicated a new city on the site of the ancient Greek town of Byzantium, on the western shore of the Bosporus, where Europe and Asia face each other across a narrow channel of water. He named it after himself. He intended it to be the new center of the empire, more defensible than Rome, better positioned for the eastern frontiers, where the real military pressure was concentrated, unburdened by the accumulated political weight of a city that had been doing things a certain way for 1,000 years. He designed it personally. He walked the boundaries of the new city himself, tracing the line of the walls he wanted built, moving outward from the old Greek core in expanding arcs until his companions, struggling to keep up, asked him how far he intended to go. "As far as the one ahead of me leads me," he said, gesturing forward. The sources disagree about whether he was speaking literally or spiritually. The ambiguity seems entirely appropriate for a man who had spent decades refusing to resolve the ambiguities at the center of his own life. Now look at what he built inside those walls. Constantinople had churches, significant omes, the Church of the Holy Apostles, which Constantine built to serve as his own mausoleum, placing himself symbolically among the 12. That is not the gesture of a man who regards Christianity as merely a political instrument. You do not design your own tomb as an extension of the faith, unless the faith means something to you that goes beyond its usefulness. But Constantinople also had the Hippodrome, which Constantine expanded and decorated with statues and monuments gathered from across the empire, the serpent column from Delphi, the statue of Apollo, which some sources say Constantine had recarved with his own features, the accumulated symbolic wealth of the old world, brought to the new city and displayed not as conquered artifacts, but as part of the texture of the place he was building. He was not building a Christian city. He was not building a pagan city. He was building a city that contained both, organized around his own presence at the center, a place that reflected the world as he actually inhabited it, rather than the world as either of his constituencies wanted him to publicly represent. That city is the most honest self-portrait Constantine ever produced. Now come to the phrase he used to describe his own role in relation to the church. Bishop of those outside. He used this phrase in a letter, referring to himself, not bishop of the church, not member of the clergy, not even simply emperor and protector, bishop of those outside, the person responsible for the spiritual welfare of the people who were not yet inside the community, the guardian of the threshold rather than the inhabitant of the house. It is a strange phrase for a man in his position to choose, strange enough that it is worth sitting inside for a moment before moving past it. He was describing himself as adjacent to the thing he had spent decades building, present at the boundary, responsible for it, committed to it, but not fully within it. Was this theological precision, a man carefully describing his actual sacramental status with the accuracy of someone who understood the difference between building the church and belonging to it? Was it political caution, a man leaving himself room to maneuver in a world where the full implications of Christian membership were still being worked out? Was it something more personal, A man who had grown up with no stable place of his own and had arrived at the height of his power, still unable to fully inhabit the thing he had made. The sources do not answer this. Constantine does not answer this. Not in anything that survives. What survives is the behavior. And the behavior tells a story that resists the clean resolution of either faith or cynicism. He wrote to bishops with what reads, across 17 centuries, like genuine concern for the unity and health of the institution. When disputes broke out within the church, he did not simply ignore them or resolve them by imperial decree. He convened councils. He read documents. He corresponded with the parties involved at considerable length. This was a man with an empire to run, with military campaigns to plan and administrative crises to manage, and a court full of people competing for his attention. He spent time on church disputes that he did not strictly need to spend, and he spent it with an attention that the sources consistently describe as engaged rather than perfunctory. He also presided over the execution of people who threatened his position. He also held the title of chief priest of the religion he was systematically replacing. He also designed his own monument with the careful attention to posthumous presentation of a man who understood that the story told about you after your death is itself a form of power. The man who wrote letters of pastoral concern to bishops and the man who managed his legacy with imperial precision were not two different people inhabiting the same body. They were the same person, acting from the same center, in the same years, shaped by the same formation that had been laid down before he was old enough to examine it. That formation ran deeper than any theology he encountered, deeper than any council he convened or basilica he funded. It was the thing installed in a boy who watched his mother displaced by the logic of someone else's ambition, who lived for years as someone else's guarantee, who learned in the specific texture of those experiences that the world had a shape, and the shape did not change simply because you had risen to the point where you could see it whole. Christianity offered him something real, something that went beyond political utility. The evidence of 30 years of engagement points toward a man for whom the faith was not simply a mask worn over a face that felt nothing behind it, but the faith had arrived into a self that was already formed, already shaped around certain convictions about control and position, and the permanent conditionality of everything that felt like safety. And those convictions did not dissolve because a new framework had arrived to supplement them. They continued to operate underneath the framework, in the places the framework could not reach, expressing themselves in decisions that the theology he was building the world around should have prevented, but did not. He stood at the threshold of the thing he had built for 31 years, not because he could not choose to enter, because the man he was, made by the world he had come from, could not fully release what entering would have required him to release. The baptism, at the end, was the only possible ending for a life lived at exactly that distance. But before the ending, there was Nicaea, and Nicaea is where the story of Constantine's mind becomes most visible. In 318, a priest in Alexandria named Arius began teaching something that seemed, to him, like common sense. If God the Father had always existed, and if God the Son had been begotten by the Father, then there must have been a moment before the Son existed. The Son was divine, yes, exalted above all creation, yes, but the Son was not co-eternal with the Father, was not, in the most precise theological sense, of the same substance. There was a hierarchy, the Father above, the Son below, both divine, but not equally so. It was a tidy argument, logically coherent, grounded in a straightforward reading of certain scriptural passages that anyone could check. It nearly destroyed the church. Within a few years, the eastern half of the empire was consuming itself over the question. Bishops were writing letters, accusing other bishops of heresy. Communities were dividing along theological lines that mapped, with uncomfortable precision, onto existing political and personal rivalries. Clergy who had survived the great persecution together, who had watched friends die rather than renounce their faith, were now refusing to share communion with each other over a dispute about the precise metaphysical relationship between two persons of a trinity that neither side fully claimed to understand. Constantine watched this from a distance at first. He had just defeated Licinius in 324, finally consolidating control over the entire empire after more than a decade of managing its western half, while the east remained under a separate ruler. He was, for the first time, the single emperor of a unified Roman world, and the religion he had spent 12 years elevating was tearing itself apart. He wrote a letter to the parties involved, a long letter, diplomatic in tone, urging reconciliation, suggesting that the dispute was fundamentally about words rather than substance, that men of goodwill on both sides could surely find language they could agree on. He sent the letter east with a trusted bishop named Hosius of Cordoba, who was to deliver it personally and facilitate the reconciliation Constantine believed was possible. Hosius came back and told him the situation was considerably worse than a letter could fix. Constantine made a decision that had no precedent in the history of either Rome or Christianity. He called a council, not a regional council, not a gathering of bishops from a single province, but a universal council, drawing representatives from every part of the Christian world. He invited every bishop in the empire. He paid their travel expenses from the imperial treasury. He provided accommodation. He made attendance, if not technically mandatory, strongly encouraged in the way that imperial, strong encouragement tends to operate when the person doing the encouraging commands the largest army in the Western world. More than 300 bishops came to Nicaea in the spring of 325. They came from Spain and from Persia and from Egypt and from the frontier provinces and from the great cities of the eastern Mediterranean. They came representing communities that had developed over 3 centuries of independent existence, their own theological traditions, their own ways of reading the texts, their own understanding of what the faith required and what it permitted. They arrived to find an emperor waiting for them. Consider what that room looked like from the inside. Many of the men who walked into the council hall at Nicaea carried visible marks of the great persecution: eyes put out, hands removed, scars from torture that had not fully faded and would not fade in whatever years remained to them. These were people who had refused to renounce their faith under conditions of genuine physical danger, who had watched the Roman state try to destroy everything they believed in and had held on anyway. And the man sitting at the center of the room, in imperial robes, presiding over the proceeding, was the representative of that same state. Different emperor. Yes. Different policy. Yes. But the purple was the same purple. The authority was the same authority, and that man had not been baptized. Constantine opened the council with a speech. The sources preserve fragments of it. He spoke of the importance of unity. He spoke of division within the church as more dangerous to him personally than any military threat. A striking thing for a man who had spent his adult life fighting wars to say out loud in a room full of people who had never fought one. He spoke of his hope that the assembled bishops could find agreement. Then he sat down and let them argue. They argued for weeks. The theological substance of the debate was genuine, and the men on both sides of it were serious thinkers who had given their lives to these questions. This was not a performance staged for an emperor's benefit. The bishops who supported Arius believed they were defending an accurate understanding of what the texts actually said. The bishops who opposed him believed they were defending the faith against a corruption that would hollow it out from the center. Both sides were operating from real conviction, shaped by real study. In a dispute that had real consequences for how 200 years of Christian thought would be understood going forward, Constantine followed the proceedings with an attention that surprised the people around him. He asked questions. He read the documents submitted by both sides. He met privately with key figures from each faction. He was not performing interest. He was genuinely trying to understand the shape of the problem. Because Constantine had learned, across decades of navigating complex situations, that you cannot work a room you do not understand, but he was not adjudicating the dispute on its theological merits. He knew he lacked the formation for that, and he did not pretend otherwise. What he was doing was something different and in some ways more consequential than theological adjudication. He was deciding what the outcome needed to be, and then working the process until the process produced it. The outcome he needed was unity, not theological precision for its own sake, not the correct answer to the question of the Son's relationship to the Father, insofar as correct was even a stable concept in a dispute this genuinely difficult. Unity, a formula that enough bishops could sign that the Church could present itself to the empire and to itself as a coherent body with a coherent position, rather than a collection of competing factions held together by nothing stronger than shared suffering. A divided Church could not do what Constantine needed the Church to do. It could not serve as the new language of legitimacy for an empire that needed a new language. It could not provide the coherence that Roman paganism had failed to provide if it was itself incoherent. The theological question and the political question were not, from where Constantine was sitting, separably. They were the same question asked from different angles. The formula that emerged from Nicaea was the word homoousios, of the same substance. The Son was of the same substance as the Father, not similar substance, not subordinate substance. The same, it was a Greek philosophical term that did not appear in Scripture. Several of the bishops who signed the creed containing it had significant reservations about it. Some signed because they believed it. Some signed because the emperor was in the room, and they understood what it meant to have the emperor in the room, and to be seen refusing what the emperor was clearly working toward. Some signed because they were exhausted after weeks of argument and had decided that unity, even on terms they were not entirely comfortable with, was better than continued division. The Nicene Creed, recited in Christian churches across the world every week for 1700 years, produced in a room that an unbaptized emperor had convened, paid for, presided over, and quietly steered toward a conclusion he had identified before the first bishop arrived. Constantine declared the council's decisions binding on the entire church. Bishops who refused to sign were exiled. Several were. Now, sit with what happened at Nicaea before moving past it, because it contains the clearest picture available of how Constantine's mind actually worked at full extension. He walked into a room full of men who had given their lives to questions he had not given his life to. He sat at the center of a theological dispute that had been developing for years among people who knew the texts and the traditions and the competing arguments with an intimacy he could not match and did not claim to match. He had no standing, by any measure of expertise or ecclesiastical authority, that the Church itself recognized, to decide what the outcome of that dispute should be, and he decided anyway, not by claiming theological authority he did not have, not by announcing that the emperor's preference was now doctrine, but by controlling the conditions, by choosing who came, and ensuring they came, by managing the process with enough patience and enough visible engagement that the men in the room felt taken seriously, which made them more willing to take seriously the outcome he was working toward, by making the cost of non-compliance clear enough that the calculation shifted for the men on the margins. This is the specific intelligence that Constantine had been developing since childhood, not the intelligence of the philosopher or the theologian, the intelligence of the man who understands that the most important question in any room is not what the right answer is, but who gets to decide what counts as right. At Nicaea, that man was Constantine. He would leave the council and return to an empire that was still, in its majority, not Christian, still carrying the old symbols on its coins, still performing the old rituals in the old temples. He himself was still unbaptized, still officially responsible for the religious life of the old world, even as he was determining the doctrine of the new one. And the Nicene Creed would outlast every army he ever fielded, every building he ever funded, every campaign he ever planned, because the argument about the nature of God was also an argument about the nature of authority, about who had the right to speak for a civilization, about whether that right derived from expertise, from tradition, from community consensus, or from the simple, irreducible fact of power organized in the right direction at the right moment. At Nicaea, Constantine answered that question, not with words, with presence. In the summer of 326, Constantine killed his eldest son. There was no trial, no public accusation, no formal process of any kind that the historical record preserves. Crispus, the firstborn son of the most powerful man in the world, was arrested and executed at Pola, in what is now Croatia, by order of his father. The charge, if there was one, was never announced. The justification, if there was one, was never recorded. The imperial machinery that Constantine had spent decades building processed the death of his heir the way it processed everything else, efficiently and without visible emotion, and moved on. A few weeks later, Fausta died, Constantine's wife, the mother of his 3 younger sons, the woman whose father had arranged her marriage to Constantine decades earlier as part of the political architecture of the Tetrarchy. She died in an overheated bath. The official account called it an accident. Nobody believed the official account. The sources that survive are uniformly skeptical. And the timing, weeks after the death of her stepson, made the skepticism almost unavoidable. Both deaths were ordered by the same man. In the same summer, in the same year that he was presiding over the construction of churches in Jerusalem and Rome, and writing letters to bishops about the importance of Christian unity and the proper interpretation of the council he had convened at Nicaea the previous year. History has been trying to explain this for 1700 years. The most persistent theory connects the 2 deaths through Fausta. She accused Crispus of something. The sources suggest, possibly of attempting to seduce her, possibly of a political threat to the succession of her own sons. The kind of accusation that in a Roman imperial court carried enormous weight and required an immediate response from an emperor who could not afford to appear weak or uncertain in matters of dynastic security. Constantine acted. Crispus died. And then, the theory continues, Helena intervened. She told her son that the accusation was false, that Fausta had manufactured it for reasons of her own, that Crispus, the grandson Helena had known since his birth, the young man who had distinguished himself in battle and earned the genuine respect of the soldiers who served under him, was innocent of whatever he had been accused of. Constantine had already acted. He could not undo what he had done to his son. What he could do, and what the evidence suggests he did, was what the Roman world had always permitted powerful men to do with inconvenient women. Fausta died in her bath. Her name began to disappear from the inscriptions where it had appeared alongside his. The official record started the slow process of editing her out. It is a theory that fits the available evidence without being proven by it. The sources hint at it from multiple directions. They do not confirm it. What they agree on is the sequence and the silence that followed. Constantine did not speak of Crispus again. He did not speak of Fausta again. He applied to both of them the Roman practice of damnatio memoriae, the condemnation of memory, removing their names from inscriptions, destroying their portraits, eliminating the official record of their existence as thoroughly as the physical machinery of the state could manage. They were not simply killed, they were unmade. And then Constantine continued building his city, continued writing his letters, continued funding his churches, continued the vast, sustained, empire-wide project of constructing a Christian world that he had been engaged in for 14 years. Now, stop here. Do not move past this too quickly, because this silence, this continuation, is the most psychologically revealing moment in the entire story. Not the killing. Emperors killed people. Constantine had grown up in a world where emperors killed people, including the people closest to them, and the world continued without requiring explanation or apology or visible remorse. The killing fits a pattern that the Roman world had established long before Constantine arrived in it. The silence is what does not fit. A man who had spent 14 years building the architecture of a faith whose central teachings were about forgiveness and mercy and the sanctity of human life continued the next morning, and the morning after that, and every morning for the remaining 11 years of his reign. Without publicly acknowledging what those mornings were built on top of, he attended to his correspondence. He reviewed his building projects. He made decisions about the administration of an empire and the governance of a church. He did all of this with the particular quality of a person who has learned, at a very deep level, that the only direction available to him is forward. He had learned this long before 326. He had learned it in the court at Nicaea, where the correct response to an uncomfortable reality was not to examine it, but to read it accurately and decide what it required of you next. He had learned it in the years of patient maneuvering before Milvian Bridge. When the path forward required setting aside everything that was not directly useful to arriving at the destination, he had learned it every time he made a decision that the situation required and that a different kind of man, formed differently, might not have been able to make. The forward motion was not callousness, or not only callousness, it was the specific survival mechanism of a specific kind of person, operating at the level of reflex rather than calculation by 326, because it had been operating for so long that it no longer required conscious activation. What belongs here? In the space that Constantine himself refused to fill with words, is a question about what the Christianity he was building actually meant to him in this moment, not in the political sense, in the personal one. He was building a world organized around a faith whose founder had said very specific things about what you owed the people who wronged you, about forgiveness, about the limits of retribution, about the kind of account a person would eventually have to give for what they had done. Constantine had funded the copying and distribution of the texts that contained these teachings. He had presided over the council that had defined the doctrine of the faith that these teachings belonged to. He had written letters to bishops about the importance of Christian virtue in public life, and in the summer of 326, those teachings had not been enough to reach the place in him where the decision about Crispus was made. This is not an indictment. It is an observation about what Christianity had and had not done to the man who had done more than any other individual to make it the dominant faith of the Western world. It had shaped his language. It had shaped his public behavior. It had shaped the institutional world he was building. It had not reshaped the formation that had been laid down before it arrived. The formation that understood certain decisions as necessary in a way that did not leave room for the kind of hesitation that the faith he was building should, by its own logic, have required. Helena understood what had happened. She did not say so publicly. There was no public forum in which she could have said so. And she was not the kind of woman the sources suggest would have chosen a public forum in any case. What she did, in the months following the death of her grandson, was leave. She went to Jerusalem, not a brief visit, a sustained pilgrimage, undertaken in her 70s, at considerable personal cost in terms of health and comfort, to the places where her faith told her the most important events in human history had occurred. She distributed charity along the way with a generosity that the sources describe in detail. She commissioned churches. She was present, according to tradition, at the excavation of the site where the true cross was believed to have been buried. Whether the last detail is history or the accumulation of legend around a real journey is a question scholars have not resolved. What is not a question is why the journey happened when it happened. A woman in her 70s does not cross the Mediterranean and travel through the territories of the Eastern Empire in the immediate aftermath of her grandson's death because the timing is convenient. She goes because she needs something that the court of her son, in the summer of 326, cannot provide. She goes because the faith she had come to fully inhabit, the faith her son had built the world around but could not himself fully enter, offered her something for the grief and the horror of what she had witnessed that no imperial palace could offer. She went to the place where, her faith told her, death had been answered. She came back. She died a few years later, in her son's arms. Honored to the end. He built her a mausoleum in Rome. He named a city after her. The grief he expressed at her death, recorded in sources that had no particular reason to manufacture it, reads as genuine in a way that the silences around Crispus and Fausta do not. She was the one person in his life he had loved without calculation and lost without having chosen to lose her. That distinction matters, not as a redemption of what he had done in 326. Nothing redeems that, in the clean sense the word usually implies, but as evidence that the man who had ordered those deaths was not made entirely of the formation that had produced the capacity to order them. That something else existed alongside that formation, something that expressed itself in the relationship with his mother in a way it could not or did not express itself anywhere else. He was capable of that. He was also capable of 326. Both were true. Both were him. The Christianity he had built the world around had not resolved that contradiction, had not reached deep enough to make the two things impossible to hold simultaneously. Perhaps nothing could have. Perhaps the depth required was simply beyond what the years and the formation and the nature of the man had left accessible. The city kept being built. The letters kept being written. The churches kept going up across the empire. And in the silence where Crispus and Fausta had been, Constantine moved forward, the only direction he had ever known how to move. 11 years passed between the summer of 326 and the spring of 337. 11 years is a long time. long enough to build a city, long enough to watch a church transform from a persecuted minority into the institutional backbone of the most powerful empire in the Western world. Long enough for a man who has spent his entire adult life moving forward to begin. In the quiet moments that sustained forward motion eventually produces, to feel the weight of what the moving has cost. Constantine spent those years doing what he had always done: administering, campaigning, writing letters, convening councils, managing the ongoing disputes within the church that Nicaea had settled officially and inflamed practically, because the bishops who had signed the creed under pressure had not, in many cases, stopped believing what they had believed before they signed it. He managed the eastern frontier. He planned a campaign to the Holy Land that he spoke of in terms that the sources find difficult to categorize as purely military. He watched his sons grow into the men who would eventually tear his empire apart, fighting each other for what he had built. He was also, in these years, a man who had killed his son and his wife and had not spoken of either of them since. That silence was not nothing. It was a presence, the specific weight of something that cannot be addressed, because addressing it would require a language that the man who needed to use it had not developed, had perhaps deliberately not developed, because development in that direction would have made the things the silence was covering impossible to cover. He built instead. The city that bore his name was taking shape on the Bosporus, in a way that exceeded even the ambitions he had started with. Constantinople was becoming not simply a new administrative center, but a new kind of city, one that reflected the world Constantine had been building across 3 decades, rather than the world he had inherited. Its churches were large and numerous, and positioned with an intention that the traditional Roman city plan had never had to accommodate. Its public spaces carried both the symbols of the old world, the statues and monuments gathered from across the empire, and the symbols of the new, the crosses and the Christian imagery that were becoming, under his patronage, the visual language of imperial power. The city was a self-portrait, not a flattering one in the sense of concealing flaws, an honest one in the sense of showing exactly what the painter actually was, rather than what any single constituency wanted him to be. A man between 2 worlds, building a home for both, unable to fully inhabit either, expressing in stone and marble and the layout of streets and the positioning of churches the same irreducible complexity that the written record shows and the coins show and the phrase bishop of those outside shows. He was also, in these final years, thinking about what came after him in a way that the earlier decades of his reign had not required. He had not designated a clear heir. This was not an oversight. It was a decision, or at least the product of a set of considerations that had never resolved into a decision. His sons, by Fausta, were his official successors. But Fausta was gone from the record in a way that made the sons who carried her blood a complicated symbol of everything the record had been edited to remove. The succession question sat unresolved, the way certain questions sit unresolved in the lives of people who understand that resolving them would cost more than leaving them open. The empire he was going to leave behind was, by every external measure, transformed in ways that would have been unimaginable to the boy who had sat in Diocletian's court and watched the most powerful man in the world preside over the persecution of the community that would outlast everything. Diocletian built. The physical landscape had changed. Churches stood where temples had stood. The city on the Bosporus was growing into something that would become, within a generation, the undisputed center of the Eastern world. The legal code had been amended in ways that reflected the influence of Christian ethics on Roman governance. Protections for slaves, restrictions on the exposure of unwanted infants, changes to the treatment of prisoners that a legal tradition organized purely around Roman ideas of property and power would not have generated on its own. The institutional landscape had changed more profoundly. The church that Constantine had found as a persecuted minority was now the favored institution of the most powerful state in the Western world. Its bishops had access to the emperor. Its buildings were funded by the imperial treasury. Its disputes were adjudicated by councils that the emperor convened and presided over. Its clergy were exempt from the civic obligations that consumed the time and resources of every other class in Roman society. What the church had gained was real. What it had also gained, inseparably from everything else, was entanglement. The institution that had survived the great persecution by operating outside the structures of Roman power was now operating inside them. The bishops who had once been accountable primarily to their communities were now also accountable to an emperor who funded their buildings and attended their councils and had demonstrated, at Nicaea and in the exiles that followed, that he had views about how the church's internal disputes should resolve. The theology that had developed in communities existing at the margins of Roman life was now being shaped, in ways large and small, by proximity to the center. This was not a corruption in the simple sense. It was a transformation. The thing that had survived persecution was not the same thing that emerged from imperial favor. It was larger, more powerful, more organizationally sophisticated, more capable of the kind of sustained institutional action that changes the world over centuries. It was also more political, more entangled with the logic of power, more shaped by the concerns of an institution that now had something substantial to protect. Constantine had given the church everything it needed to become the dominant institution of Western civilization. He had also given it everything it needed to become the thing that its own founding documents most consistently warned against. That is not an accusation. It is the irreducible consequence of what happens when a community organized around one set of values acquires the resources and the power that a different set of values generates. The two things do not simply coexist. They work on each other. They reshape each other, and the reshaping goes in directions that no individual, not the emperor who initiated it, and not the bishops who navigated it, can fully control or fully predict. The Western Roman Empire that Constantine spent his life consolidating collapsed 150 years after his death. The institution that survived was the church. The network he had elevated and resourced and connected to the imperial center outlasted the imperial center by centuries. When the Western Empire fell, the bishops were still there. The administrative structure of dioceses and provinces that the church had borrowed from Roman governance continued to function after Roman governance itself had ceased to function. The Latin language survived as the language of the church long after it ceased to be the language of power. Constantine did not design this outcome. He was trying to save the empire. The church was the instrument he chose for the project. The instrument outlasted the project, and in outlasting it, became something larger than either Constantine or the bishops he worked with could have fully imagined in the years when they were building it together. Now, come back to the man, in the last years of his reign, in the quiet that sustained power eventually produces when the immediate crises have been managed and the larger structures are running on their own momentum. Constantine was increasingly preoccupied with questions that power could not answer. He wrote about death with a frequency that his earlier correspondence does not show. He arranged his burial with a specificity that went beyond normal imperial concern for posthumous dignity. The Church of the Holy Apostles, the mausoleum he had built for himself in Constantinople, placed him at the center of a circular space surrounded by the cenotaphs of the 12. In an arrangement that made a claim about where Constantine stood in relation to the faith he had spent his life elevating, he was still managing the presentation, still thinking about how the story would be told after he was gone. The instinct that had been present since before Milvian Bridge, the instinct of a man who understood that the narrative of a life is itself a form of power, had not left him in the final years. But something else was also present. He spoke of wanting to be baptized in the Jordan River, to travel to the place where Christ himself had been baptized and receive the sacrament in those specific waters. It was not a plan that military or administrative necessity required. It had the quality, in the way the sources describe it, of something personal, something that had been deferred for a long time and that he was allowing himself, in the slowing of the final years, to want openly. The Jordan plan did not happen. The illness that came for him in the spring of 337 did not leave him time for it. But the wanting was there, in the record, in a man who had spent 31 years building the Christian world from the outside. The wanting was there, and it points towards something that the clean accounts of Constantine, both the ones that celebrate him and the ones that condemn him, consistently underweight. He was not only what he built, he was also what he could not quite reach, what he circled for 3 decades without fully arriving at, what the formation of his early life had made it possible for him to build and impossible for him to fully inhabit. The cost of what he built was not only paid by the people the building required him to harm, it was also paid by Constantine himself, in the specific currency of a life spent at the edge of the thing it was devoted to. That is not a tragedy in the clean literary sense. Clean tragedy requires a shape that actual lives almost never have. It is something messier and more honest than tragedy. It is what it looks like when a person of genuine capability and genuine limitation builds something real. The achievement and the cost are not separate entries on a ledger. They are the same thing, seen from different distances. Nicaea, May 337. The same city where it began. Constantine had spent part of his boyhood in this city as someone else's guarantee. He had eaten at its tables and walked its streets and learned, in its corridors of power, the curriculum that no school taught openly. He had left it in the night, killing post horses behind him, moving toward a future that the city's masters had not intended for him. He had come back to die in it. The illness had been developing for some time before he acknowledged it fully. He had travelled first to the hot springs at Helenopolis, the city he had named for his mother, hoping that the waters would help. They did not help. He moved on to Nicaea, where the medical resources of the empire were more concentrated and the bishops he would need were more accessible. He summoned them, not one bishop, several men from the region, gathered to witness something that Constantine had apparently been thinking about for longer than the illness that was now making it urgent. He had spoken before, in letters and in conversation with people close to him, about his desire to be baptized in the Jordan River. That plan was not going to happen now. The Jordan was too far. The illness was too advanced. The moment had arrived before the preferred circumstances had arranged themselves around it. He made do with the circumstances he had. He confessed. The sources do not tell us what he said in that confession, or how long it took, or what the bishop who heard it said in response. That silence is appropriate in a way that no other silence in this story is. Whatever passed in that exchange belonged to Constantine and to God and to the bishop who received it, and none of the three left a record that survived. After the confession, he was baptized. He removed his imperial robes, Consider that gesture. Not symbolically. Not yet. Physically, the robes of a Roman emperor were not simple garments. They were weighted with gold thread and precious stones. They were objects of enormous material value and enormous symbolic weight, each element of them carrying a specific meaning within the visual language of Roman imperial power. They announced, to everyone who saw them, not simply who was wearing them, but what that person was, what category of being they occupied in the Roman understanding of the world. He took them off. He put on white, the white garment of the newly baptized, the color that Christian tradition assigned to people at the very beginning of their journey in the faith. People who had just entered the community for the first time. People who were, in the theological language of the ritual, newly born into something they had not existed inside before. He had been emperor for 31 years. He had won battles across 3 decades and 3 continents. He had built a city and named it after himself. He had presided over the council that defined Christian doctrine for the next 2,000 years. He had changed the legal, institutional, and physical landscape of the most powerful empire in the Western world. He put on the white garment of a beginner. The sources say he was joyful. That is the word they use. Not relieved, though relief seems like it would be a reasonable response for a man who had been carrying what he had been carrying for 31 years. Joyful, as if something had been set down that had been held for a very long time, and that the holding had cost more than the record shows. We cannot verify the joy from this distance. The sources that describe it had their own investments in how the story of Constantine's death was told. But the word is there, used by people who were present, or close to people who were present, and it is consistent with something that the preceding chapters of this story have been circling. Constantine had spent 31 years managing the distance between himself and the faith he was building. He had maintained that distance with the discipline of a man who understood that full entry into the community meant accepting constraints that the exercise of imperial power routinely required him to violate. He had stayed at the threshold, bishop of those outside, always arriving, never quite there. In the white garment, there was nothing left to manage. He was no longer the emperor who favored Christianity. He was no longer the man who had built the church without belonging to it. He was no longer the bishop of those outside, the guardian of the threshold, the person responsible for the spiritual welfare of the people who had not yet entered. He was, in the terms of the ritual he had just undergone, simply the newest member of the community. He had spent 3 decades building from the outside. Whatever he had been before, he was starting over. Consider what starting over meant for a man, formed the way Constantine was formed. Control had been the organizing principle of his life since before he was old enough to name it as such. The conviction that position was conditional, that the only reliable protection against the conditionality of everything was the sustained, vigilant management of the circumstances that determined your position. That conviction had been installed before Helena was left behind and reinforced every year afterward in every room he had moved through on the way to where he ended up. To be baptized, in the theology of his era, was to release that management to something else, to acknowledge that the account was no longer being kept by the person who had spent 31 years trying to control what went into it, to put on the garment of a beginner and mean it. Whether he meant it in the full sense that the theology required is not a question the sources answer. It is not a question this story can answer. It is perhaps not a question that has an answer in the clean sense that questions are supposed to have answers. What the sources preserve is the gesture. The robes removed, the white garment accepted, the joy described by the people in the room, the 3 days that followed, in which he did not put the imperial robes back on. He died still wearing white. His body was transported to Constantinople, to the Church of the Holy Apostles that he had built for exactly this purpose. He was placed in the golden sarcophagus he had prepared. At the center of the circular space, surrounded by the cenotaphs of the 12 apostles, in the arrangement he had designed to make a specific claim about where he stood in relation to the faith he had spent his life elevating. Even in death, the presentation was managed. Both things were true simultaneously. The man who had finally released control and the man who had arranged, years in advance, that the releasing would be witnessed and remembered in a specific way. They were not different men. They were the same man, expressing in the last days of his life the same irreducible complexity that had defined him from the first. He had come back to Nicaea to die. The city where he had first learned that position was conditional, where he had first understood that the world arranged people into those who managed their circumstances and those whose circumstances managed them, where the curriculum that shaped everything that followed had been delivered not in lectures, but in the texture of a life lived at the pleasure of someone more powerful. He had left that city in the night, moving fast, building toward something that the people who held him there had not intended for him. He had come back wearing white, beginning at the very end. Something he had been standing at the edge of his entire life. The room went quiet, and the question he had carried without fully answering, the question of who he was in the space between what he had built and what he had been able to keep for himself, that question did not resolve in the quiet. It simply stopped being his to carry. History kept two versions of this man. The first is the Constantine of the Church, the great convert, the instrument of providence, the emperor who looked up at the sky before the most important battle of his life and saw a sign, and who spent the next 31 years building the world that sign had pointed him toward. This Constantine is a saint in the Eastern Orthodox tradition. His feast day is the 21st of May. He is called equal to the apostles, a title that places him in a category occupied by almost no one else in Christian history who was not actually an apostle. The second is the Constantine of the skeptics, the cold political calculator, the man who recognized in Christianity a tool of empire and used it with the precision of a surgeon and the sentiment of a general, who built churches the way he built forts, for strategic advantage, who presided over councils he could not theologically understand in order to produce outcomes he needed politically, who killed his son and his wife in the same summer he was funding basilicas in Jerusalem. This Constantine is a cautionary tale, evidence that power corrupts the things it touches, including the things it claims to love. Both versions have survived for 1700 years because both versions have something real in them. The church needed a founder worthy of what it became. The skeptics needed evidence that what it became was shaped by forces the theology could not fully account for. Both needs are legitimate. Both versions answer them. But both versions make the same mistake. They flatten a man into a meaning. They take the irreducible complexity of a human life, a life formed in specific circumstances that no one chose, shaped by pressures that left specific marks, making decisions under conditions of genuine uncertainty with consequences that extended far beyond what any single person could have anticipated. And they compress it into a lesson, into a point, into the kind of clean shape that actual lives almost never have. The Constantine, who exists between those two versions, is harder to hold. He does not resolve into a lesson. He does not provide the satisfying closure of a story that knows what it means before it has finished being told. He is a boy watching his mother leave in the particular silence of adults who have decided that explanation is unnecessary. He is a teenager in a foreign court, learning in the texture of his daily life. That warmth and threat can occupy the same room without either one cancelling the other out. He is a commander who stood at the edge of the most important battle of his life and reached for something beyond the military tradition he had been formed in, and found in that reaching a direction that stayed with him for the rest of his life, without ever fully resolving into either faith or calculation. He is the man who built churches and killed his son in the same year, who wrote letters of genuine pastoral concern to bishops and held the title of chief priest of the religion he was systematically replacing, who designed his own tomb among the apostles and managed the presentation of his death with the same careful attention he had applied to every significant moment of his reign, who put on white at the end and lay down in it and died in it, beginning something at the very moment he was finishing everything else. He is also the son who elevated his mother when he had the power to do it, who named a city after her, who sent her to Jerusalem with imperial resources and imperial blessing when she needed to go somewhere the court could not take her, who grieved her death in a way the sources describe as genuine, in a life where genuine grief was not always the response the record shows to loss. He is not the saint, and he is not the cynic. He is the man who discovered, at a bridge over the Tiber in 312, that faith and power could be fused into something neither one could become alone, and who spent the next 31 years living inside that fusion, building with it, governed by it, unable to fully separate what he believed from what he needed, unable to stand fully inside the faith he was building, because the man he had become required a distance that the faith itself kept asking him to close. He closed it at the end. In white, in Nicaea, in the city where the distance had first been established, in a boy who learned too early that everything given could be taken back. Whether that closing was peace or the final management of a legacy he had been constructing his entire life is a question the sources circle without answering, and that unanswered quality, that irreducible openness at the center of the story, is not a failure of the historical record. It is the most honest thing the historical record has to offer about a man this complicated. Now step back from Constantine the individual and look at what remains, not the buildings, though some of them are still standing, not the city, though it lasted 1,000 years after his death as the center of a civilization that called itself Roman long after Rome itself had fallen, not the creed, though it is still recited every week in churches across the world by people who could not tell you the name of the emperor who presided over its creation. What remains is a question. He left behind the question of what happens when faith and power share a bed, when the institution that speaks for the sacred and the institution that speaks for the state are not separate things, but partners, each shaping the other, each borrowing the other's authority, each unable to fully extract itself from the other's logic without losing something it cannot afford to lose. That question did not begin with Constantine. Rulers had been claiming divine sanction for their authority since the first ruler looked up at the sky and decided the sky was watching back. But Constantine gave the question a specific form, a specific architecture, a specific set of institutional arrangements that encoded the fusion of faith and power into the structure of Western civilization in ways that every subsequent generation inherited, whether they chose to or not. Every argument in the Western tradition about the proper relationship between religious authority and political authority is an argument with Constantine's answer. The argument has never been resolved. It has only changed shape, generation by generation. As the specific institutional arrangements shift while the underlying question stays the same, he did not resolve the question. He made it permanent. And perhaps that is the most accurate summary of what Constantine was. Not a saint, not a cynic, not a convert, and not a calculator, or not only either of those things. He was the man who took the most consequential, unresolved question in Western civilization and built it into the foundation so deep that no one who came after him could pretend it had a simple answer. The question is still there. Constantine is still there too, not as a ghost, not as a cautionary tale or a founding saint or any of the other clean shapes that history tried to compress him into. As a structure, as the specific way the question was asked and the specific way the world was arranged around the asking of it. He put on white at the end and lay down and died in it. The question he left behind has never stopped being asked, and the world he built to ask it in is still, in more ways than we fully account for, the world we are living in.